Imagine standing in the blazing Egyptian sun, the Nile glistening in the distance, and in front of you rises not just a tomb, but a gateway to the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians did not view death as an end. To them, death was a transition, a passage into another form of existence where one's soul could live on, provided that every single ritual was carried out with absolute precision. And let me tell you, the Egyptians were obsessed with the details of this journey. Their death rituals were not only elaborate but deeply symbolic, combining magic, religion, and a vision of eternity that still fascinates us thousands of years later. So, let's take this journey together. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself walking through the halls of an Egyptian temple. The air smells of incense. The walls are covered with hieroglyphs telling stories of gods and pharaohs. The priests are chanting, their voices echoing under the high ceilings. Somewhere, in a dimly lit chamber, lies a body prepared for the sacred process that would ensure its owner eternal life. This was the world of ancient Egyptian death rituals. Mummification was at the heart of it all. We often imagine rows of bandages, but the process was far more complex, lasting up to 70 days. First, the body was carefully cleansed and purified. Organs were removed, each one with its own ritual. The lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines were placed into canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The heart, however, was often left inside the body. It was considered the seat of the soul and would later be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. Now picture this, a priest dressed in the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, reciting prayers as he anoints the body with oils and resins. Every step was a magical safeguard, protecting the deceased from decay and from the dangers that awaited in the afterlife. The bandages were not just wrappings, they were layers of spells. In fact, inscriptions were often spoken or written during the wrapping, binding the person spiritually as much as physically. But mummification was only one part of the grand ritual. To truly prepare for eternity, one needed the Book of the Dead. This was not a single book, but rather a collection of spells, prayers, and incantations written on papyrus scrolls. These texts acted as a kind of survival guide for the afterlife. Imagine a travel guide, but instead of telling you where to find the best markets in Cairo, it explained how to avoid soul-eating demons, how to pass judgment in the Hall of Truth, and how to call upon the gods for protection. Without it, the soul was at risk. With it, the soul had a fighting chance to reach the field of reeds, a heavenly version of Egypt itself, filled with rivers, fertile fields, and eternal sunshine. One of the most dramatic rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony. Picture the scene, the mummy, lying in its coffin, surrounded by priests and family. His special tool, shaped like an adze, is touched to the lips and eyes of the deceased. This act symbolically restored the senses, sight, speech, breathe, so that the person could live again in the afterlife. It was not enough to preserve the body. The soul had to be reawakened, reconnected, and fully functional in its new world. Every detail mattered, because in the Egyptian view, eternity was long, and you wanted to be well prepared. Of course, these rituals were not the same for everyone. Pharaohs and nobles received the most elaborate treatments, with golden coffins, vast tombs, and texts painted in dazzling colors on the walls. Think of the Valley of the Kings, where hidden beneath the desert, tunnels and chambers stretched into the earth, each one filled with treasures, food, statues, and everything the dead might need. Ordinary people, however, often had simpler burials, but even then, the idea of the rituals remained. A small amulet, a humble prayer, a few lines from the Book of the Dead. These could mean the difference between wandering lost in darkness or stepping into eternal light. The most famous example, of course, is the tomb of Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter discovered it in 1922, the world was stunned. Gold masks, jewelry, chariots, everything a young pharaoh might need to live like a king in the afterlife. But what truly matters is not just the wealth, but the belief behind it. Every item had meaning. The mask of Tutankhamun, with its inlaid stones and serene expression, was not merely art, it was magic, meant to protect his spirit, to ensure he was recognized by the gods. At the heart of all these rituals was a single question: Have you lived a just life? The Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, the soul would be judged in the hall of Ma'at. Imagine standing before Osiris, the god of the underworld, while your heart is placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of truth. If your heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Ammon, the fearsome crocodile lion hippo monster, and your soul would cease to exist. But if it was pure and light, you were granted eternal life. This is one of the most powerful images from Egyptian mythology, an idea that still resonates with us today. And here's the fascinating part. The Egyptians were not morbid about death. To them, it was not something to fear but something to prepare for. Their tombs were not houses of despair but houses of life. Even the pyramids, those colossal structures rising from the desert, were designed not as symbols of death but as monuments to eternity. Step inside one, and you'll find corridors filled with star maps, texts, and images guiding the king's soul to the heavens. They believed the pharaoh would become one with the gods, joining the sun god, Ra, on his eternal journey across the sky. Death rituals also shaped their daily lives. Farmers, artisans, and even children were taught about the afterlife. Amulets shaped like scarabs were worn for protection. Small figurines called shebiti were placed in tombs. These were little servant statues that would magically come to life and do the hard labor for the soul in the afterlife. Imagine needing to plow the fields in eternity, but instead, your shebiti takes care of it while you enjoy everlasting peace. When we think of ancient Egypt, it's easy to focus on the grandeur of temples, the mummies, the treasures, but the real power lies in their vision of continuity. They saw life and death as two halves of the same cycle, connected by rituals that bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual. Their practices remind us that even in death, they celebrated the possibility of life. So the next time you see a golden mask in a museum, or stand before the towering columns of Karnak or Luxor, remember that these were not relics of a dead civilization. They were in many ways still airy expressions of hope, of faith, and of a dream that life could continue forever. That dream is what makes the death rituals of ancient Egypt so endlessly captivating. And if you've been fascinated by this journey, don't forget to dive deeper. Explore the Book of the Dead, look closer at the intricate tomb paintings, and imagine yourself walking among the priests, the families, and the pharaohs who believed that eternity was just one ritual away. But here's something even more intriguing. The rituals were not only about the individual, they were about the mummification. Funerals in ancient Egypt were deeply social events. Family, neighbors, and priests all took part, chanting hymns, carrying offerings, and performing acts of remembrance. The dead were not gone. They were still considered part of the family. Offerings of bread, dare, meat, and fruit were brought to the tombs regularly. These were not just symbolic. The Egyptians believed that the ka, one part of the soul, could consume the spiritual essence of the food. By feeding the dead, the living kept their memory alive. It was a cycle of care and connection that bound generations together. And think about the landscape itself. The Nile River was not just the source of life, it was also tied to death rituals. Tombs were often built on the west bank of the Nile, the side where the sun set, symbolizing the end of life and the beginning of the afterlife. Each evening, the sun god Ra was believed to descend into the underworld, fighting his way through darkness to rise again at dawn. In this cosmic drama, every human death mirrored the sun cycle, and every burial on the western side of the river became part of that eternal rhythm. This perspective shows us that death rituals in Egypt were not just religion, they were SMIC theater, connecting people, gods, nature, and the universe itself. They remind us that for the Egyptians, to die was to join the greatest story ever told, a story written in stars, stone, and sacred words, carrying the soul beyond the limits of time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with a friend who loves a good mystery. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. There's a lot more to uncover, and I'd love to have you along for the journey.